It's Wednesday, it's 11:15 and we're live in Westminster. With me today, Conservative MP Raymond Chishti, Labour MP Emma Hardy, the Daily Mirror's political editor Pippa Crerar, and the Chief Executive of the Conservative home website Mark Wallace. Today, is the war in Ukraine driving a cost of living emergency? The 1970s gave us an energy crisis. Are we seeing something similar? And what, if anything, should the government do about it? 2 million people have fled the fighting, but there's anger here about the government's refugee response.
Get them processed and get them in. This is a disgrace. When the minister leaves this dispatch box, I ask him to go back to the Home Office and tell them to get a grip.
It is the United Kingdom making the world's biggest contribution to the humanitarian aid.
An historic address by the Ukrainian president to the House of Commons. But should we be sending warplanes to Ukraine? And we'll be taking you back to the Commons live at midday for Prime Minister's questions. All that coming up. But I want to start today with a story that is in the Financial Times. We can take a look at this headline. It says, British drivers advised to limit speed to 55 miles per hour to battle against Putin. Now, this is a senior energy expert who is suggesting the public could reduce the speed they drive their cars, their temperatures at home, turn down their thermostats to cut dependence on Russian fuel. Raymond, do you think he's right?
Well, I think what we have to look at, it's if the United Kingdom, which is what we're doing, is leading the way internationally to challenge Putin's aggression in Ukraine and stand up for an international rules-based system and for democracy around the world, then on that basis, there are going to be ramifications, back at home here in the United Kingdom. And I think what we saw with President Zelenskyy yesterday, he said, with regards to the United Kingdom, he wants the United Kingdom to stand with fellow civilizations around the world. And if we are going to do that, we all around the world have to push back and find alternatives with regards to our energy supply, rather than being reliant on Russia. For example, in the UK, we have 4% of the Russian gas and 8% of, 4% of gas and 8% oil. So therefore, we have to look at all options with regards to renewables and also our own personal behaviour.
And does that mean maybe driving a bit slower, turning down the thermostat?
Well, look, I think we all have to. We all have individual responsibility. And I'm not going to sit here today to say individuals should do X, Y or Z. But the point on that, I think in 1974, when we also had challenges with regards to energy supply, I think that was one measure that was looked at in 1974. But I would say at this point, we all have to look at different avenues that we can look at to ensure that we do everything we can to move away from that Russian dependency on oil and gas and energy sector.
Emma, do you think individuals should be doing their bit to battle Putin?
Well, I think on the point around energy costs, I think we have to remember that the standing charges are going up. I mean, I'm being contacted by constituents who are telling me that, I'm forced to choose between heating and eating. But actually, when I can't put my heating on, and even if I don't put my heating on, my standing charges are increasing all the time, which is why I think, we're going to obviously talk about the cost of living in more general. I think on the limiting lorries to 55 miles an hour, I have to say, I've talked to the HGV vehicle industry quite a lot. I think if they are going to look at doing that, then we need to looking at drivers' terms and conditions, which are appalling.
What about individuals just driving more slowly?
I think it has to be. I think it frustrates me that this is always put down to the individual's responsibility. The government have a responsibility here on the cost of living crisis. The government have a responsibility to make our country less energy reliant on Russia. The government had a responsibility when they scrapped the Green Homes energy grants, which have made insulate our homes and make them a lot warmer. The fact that they've not allowed onshore wind turbines. The fact that they've been so slow to move to green renewable energy. These are all government's responsibility. And I think pushing it onto the individual, saying turn your thermostat down and drive slower, is simply not fair.
Pippa, might it be that people want to do their bit?
Well, they may well do, but I think what this does is personalise it for them. And for a long time, we've had lots of great rhetoric from the government about how the country is going to stand in support of Ukraine, rightly. There's very much a moral case for that, but very little on them on what the actual ramifications are going to be for people at home. There's already a cost of living crisis as we go into this spring, before we even get to the impact of the Ukraine crisis on energy prices. And I think what the government has probably not spelt out yet is just how dramatically this is going to impact on people. Energy bills are already set to go up by about £2,000, or to about £2,000 on average in April. We could see them push beyond £3,000 in the spring. At the same time, costs are rising across the board because of inflation. We've got tax rises and an effective freeze on universal credit coming in at the start of April. So people are already feeling the pressure. Boris Johnson and Liz Truss are rightly saying that people in Ukraine are experiencing much more immediate pain than we will at home. But it's inevitable. You know, they're our government, and people will want to hear from them what they're going to do, possibly the Chancellor in the budget later this month, to directly help them with these cost of living pressures that are coming as a result of all of this.
I mean, Mark, Pippa's making the point there might be a limit to what individuals can do, but would you maybe be prepared to drive at 55 miles an hour if it meant helping?
Personally, I don't drive, but
Well, then no.
but I think firstly, good luck. I think getting people to drive at 55 miles an hour. We were talking about this before we came on air, and I think a lot of people probably won't do it in practice. But frankly, whether people choose to do some things for the purposes of seeing it as a struggle against Putin, or whether price ends up having that effect, whether people like it or not. The fact is, I was in a taxi on the way here from the station, and the guy said, well, it now costs so much to fill up my taxi. I don't drive around town looking for jobs anymore. I go and sit in a taxi rank and turn my engine off.
It's changing his behaviour.
So it does change behaviour. Frankly, this is painful, but it's also what I'd refer to as NATO problems. We are very, very fortunate in this country that we are not in the position of Ukraine. Ukrainians are sheltering with their families in cellars under bombardment day and night at the moment. They are paying in blood for the chance of their freedom and the future of their country. We have these knock-on effects. We have to try and deal with them and lighten that load, but we're also extremely lucky that we're not in their shoes.
And let's not forget that. But while we're talking about possible knock-on effects for people in this country, let's just take a look at this headline in The Sun. It says, high-priced Ukraine war set to cost British households an extra £1,259 each this year. Now, this is based on analysis from the Centre for Economics and Business Research, and this is due, it says, to the rising cost of oil and gas as well as food as a result of this conflict. So, Remen, is it not right that actually what individuals can do to mitigate this kind of increase is really limited?
Well, look, I think what we have to look at, again, I think being completely frank with the British public, if we are going to stand up for the international rules-based system, if we are going to stand up for democracy, looking at that statement yesterday by President Zelenskyy saying, look, Britain is a great nation, a resilient nation, you've gone through those challenges before, we need your support at this difficult hour. If that is the case, and we are prepared to set up to the table to do that and lead the international coalition, whether it's to the International Criminal Court or whether it's to sanctions, there is a knock-on effect back here in the United Kingdom. And with that, what the government has done, is put aside $20 billion with regards to supporting individuals with the cost of living, whether that's with regards to capping fuel prices for the 12 years in a row, whether that's looking at alternative renewable energies. So since 2010, you've seen 500% increase in renewable sector, whether that's now in further pushing that on hydro, whether it's nuclear energy, whether that's more drilling on in the North Sea oil. So the United Kingdom, I think from a government perspective, we have put forward proposals for up to $20 billion to support individuals with the cost of living in these difficult, challenging times.
A lot of that was before the war in Ukraine, which we're now expecting to have an added impact. We've got the spring statement due from the Chancellor in a couple of weeks. Do you think that he might have to do something more? Does he need to intervene perhaps in a way that he did at the start of the COVID pandemic, where you recognise the scale of this challenge?
I think what you have to look at is where are we at the moment as the United Kingdom in terms of our economy. So for us, when we came into government, we had some of the worst budget deficits our country's ever experienced from a legacy from Labour.
You can't blame the Labour government for the cost of living
but I tell you what we can say.
Had over 10 years.
Let me say the point I'm saying is when we came into government, we inherited a very large budget deficit.
And
if you let me finish. Then I'm very happy to come back. The point I'm making on that, the point I'm making, if I may finish, that's the difference between what's going on around the world and over here. It's about democracy. Hear me out, and I'll hear you out on that. The point I was making on that is, having come into government in 2010, and I accept we've been in government 12 years, and employment has gone up by 3 million. We've dealt with that. The issue is, have we taken steps in the last 12 years to make sure that our economy now, which in the G7 is the fastest growing economy compared to all other economies, are we now in a position, having taken those decisions, to be in a position to now deal with these challenges, whether it was 400 billion on COVID, on furlough, supporting people in these difficult times? We have managed the economy in the right, proper way to ensure that we can now put in place measures through economic means to support individuals now.
Emma.
Well, with respect, and I do respect you. It's somebody who I know resigned from government on point of principle, and I always respect that. But with respect, you talk about the fastest growing economy, that's because it fell the fairest. You know, I mean, this is nonsense figures, and we can all manipulate statistics to make the point that we want to make. The point is that why should the tragedy that's happening in Ukraine, and I completely take on board the fact that we are, you know, very grateful that we're not in the same situation of those people, but why should that fall on the people who have the least? And that's the point here, that the cost of living crisis is impacting the people who already had the least, and that's simply not fair. And it goes back to when we look at national insurance contributions and we look at how that taxation system works. In national insurance contributions, we just look at that individually. We have a system where more tax is going to be taken from a care worker than a landlord who might own 27 different homes. I mean, this isn't a fair or progressive way to look at how we're going to fund these things. And when I was on the Treasury Select Committee just this week and we're listening to economists talk about this, I think that figure could actually be quite conservative. It could even be greater than that when we look at the cost of living impact on the very poorest. But I think the point where the government need to think about taking action here is, for a long time now, it has been the very poorest that have faced that heating or eating appalling dilemma. What we're going to start to see now is lots of people on lower incomes going up into the middle classes facing that same impossible dilemma. And the government must act when it comes in on the spring statement. They need to take this.
Okay, can I just say this directly before Ben on that? It's with regards to supporting those on the lowest income. Absolutely, the government, you know, has to do everything they possibly can, taking the lowest earners out of taxation, you know, which is what we did by increasing that threshold by 90%. With regards to the national insurance contributions, those who are highest earners will be paying more of that contribution. The top 1% will be paying 27%. So it's making sure doing it in a broader, fairer, progressive way.
My point about the landlords it still stands. They pay no more.
We're talking about whether the government, the Conservatives having been in power for 12 years is long enough to have dealt with some of these issues. Part of the troubling thing about this is, frankly, governments of both parties over the last 40 years have failed to really make big strategic decisions on things like energy supply. Where has been the frankness from the Blair government, from the Brown government, the coalition, Theresa May, even the current government, about the fact that when people talk a big game on, for example, net zero, when are people talking, or the Climate Change Act under Labour, when are people talking to consumers about what the actual cost in their pocket of this is? It does trouble me that we have a relatively short-termist political decision-making about not doing shale gas or not properly developing nuclear or not coming clean with people about we're going to hit a target in 2050 when, frankly, with all due respect, most of us will probably not be back on Politics Live taking accountability. If the BBC would like to book me in, my diary's open. But, you know, there's a lack of accountability there, I think, over the course of decades about really big questions that are fundamental to the cost of living or industrial competitiveness.
Pippa, I just want to get your thoughts on whether you think the Chancellor is going to have to do something more, perhaps in the shorter term, around NI, around VAT on fuel. Do you think he's going to have to move?
I think almost certainly. I mean, bear in mind that we're on the brink of another recession with all of this. I mean, that's the sort of very worrying backdrop domestically, economically to all of this. They've got the cost of living squeeze. There's another recession on the horizon, and the Chancellor, who is in a position where he was starting to be able to think about balancing the books, is now going to have to probably rip up the budget plans and start again, because there may well have to be support may have to be something on VAT cuts, maybe cuts on fuel duty, more targeted support to the less well off when it comes to dealing with those price hikes and bill hikes. And I think he will be extremely worried, having emerged from the pandemic and got the economy back to a position that he feels is able to sort of make those long-term strategic decisions, which governments do need to make. He's going to have to focus on the here and the now and supporting people in the immediate future.
Well, we have mentioned the longer-term aspect of this, and a lot of that is focused on fuel and energy, and we're expecting more from the government perhaps in the next week about its plans for this. But for now, just take a look at this story in the BBC. It says, war in Ukraine, West hits Russia with oil bans and gas curbs. This is the US, the UK and the EU, all of whom are talking about either banning or reducing oil and gas imports from Russia. We're expecting a little bit more from the Business Secretary, Kwasi Kwarteng, in the House of Commons on this later today. But, Remen, is there a danger that the fact the UK government's decided to phase this out over a period of time actually gives Putin and his regime time to respond?
Well, I think that realistically, if you're looking at the issue about the challenges we're going to face back in the UK with the energy prices, therefore, is the United Kingdom in a position at this point in time, take into account Ben's point, the strategic decisions, successive governments, look, Lib Dem, Coalition, Conservatives, Labour, have we taken over the years the strategic decisions, on extra production and North Sea oil, nuclear? The fact is we haven't, across the board. When Russia and China, they're looking at 20 years ahead. They're in a different position from an authoritarian government. They stay in for 20 years. We go through election cycles. And therefore, the challenge that we have now is with regards to either we say, we're going to do this now. OK, we've said we're not going to do it, but we've got to do it in a strategic way so that whilst we phase it out, we can increase our renewable sector, which, as I say, from 2010 has gone up by 500%, whether it's with further drilling in North Sea oil, whether it's more nuclear, whether it's hydrogen energy, whether it's offshore wind. And I think, therefore, it's going to take time. But we're not in competition with Europe or with the United States. We all have to come together because Putin is pushing on two fronts, a violent war against the Ukrainian people and an economic war against the West. And we then need to be in a coordinated way, take practical, realistic steps. And I think that's why a coordinated, phased-out approach is the right way forward.
Emma, Labour broadly supports this idea of reducing dependency on Russian imports. But it's not without risk, is it? A risk that actually it just pushes prices up higher, that might help Putin's coffers in the short term, that we might end up with some sort of stagflation, so continued high inflation, a slow economy. There are dangers to this.
There are dangers, and stagflation is genuinely a danger. And there's many points actually there I did support. I support the idea of a gradual removal. You couldn't just switch the tap off tomorrow. It would hit people's pockets. It would hit the cost of living immediately overnight. And we do need to look at investing more in renewables and onshore wind. And it is frustrating, as much as I agree with some points, I have to push back on the fact that the Conservative government actually stopped the onshore wind. Onshore wind is something that we have the production capability for. It's cleaner, it's modern, it's a far better alternative than looking at fracking. It's something we could do tomorrow. And in fact, Labour's council in Hull are looking at creating their own council-owned onshore wind energy production to look at providing some of the energy for the people who live in that local area. The government could look at supporting other councils around the country as well to look at becoming and developing that self-sufficiency. That's, to use the Prime Minister's phrase, oven ready. It's there, it can go. What I wouldn't want to see is us going down the sort of dirty alternative of fracking as a short-term solution to what is a longer-term problem. But we have to help people over this difficulty and over this pain, and that goes back to the point we were just making about the supporting with the cost of living.
Remen, just briefly, some of your colleagues want to see fracking, that debate revisited. Robert Jenrick, the former Community Secretary, among them. What do you think?
Well, I think there's clearly a difference of opinion. I've got to be realistic. What comes to me first is the safety of communities, and we've seen the challenge that we've heard before from the evidence-led approach. We're not Houston, the United States, with our geographical space and what they can produce, and the community spread out. We are in a population where we are, on the size and our geography. I think that there's real concerns with regards to fracking and the impact on the environment. But of course, those who are pushing on it, let them put forward the proposals. We'll look at them. But I do have concerns with the way it's been put so far.
Mark, do you think fracking's back on the table?
Yes, I think rightly so. I mean, you're absolutely right. We're not Houston, USA, and the UK will always rightly have its own, I would argue, stronger environmental protections. My understanding is we also have different. I'm not a geologist. My understanding is the geological picture is different in improved stability and security terms compared to the US. I'd refer you 10 years ago. I was launching a report for the Institute of Directors looking at the potential economic benefits of shale gas. Certainly cleaner than coal. And the fact is, if you're talking about a transition, you're talking about a transition away from the dirtier, more polluting sources, more affordable, wider knock-on benefits. Crucially, we need baseload capacity. If you want to have solar, you want to have wind, while battery technology improves, you need to have baseload. Some of that will be nuclear. That takes time.
Cross-party supported, actually.
Certainly, but it's also cross-party not decided on, which is the kind of practical problem. So I do think there are benefits. The IOD also, had experts in the field look at the questions about earthquakes and so on, and I think a lot of that's overblown.
I have a huge amount of admiration and respect for Ben, and I think on...
I'm Mark. Ben's much more successful.
Sorry, Mark. Sorry. But with regards to the issue on the where we are, the first presumption for me is the community safety and the impact that we have on tremors. with regards to how it affects the individuals across the country. But of course, as I said, those who want to advocate it, let them put it on the table.
OK, Pippa.
We'll have a look at it.
Well, we've got the government's energy strategy coming up, but we were told it was going to be this week, and now it seems to be a couple of weeks, so we'll see it at some point soon. And we'll hear, I think, a lot more arguments as to what sources of energy can be looked at. I mean, I think the reality is that whether you're looking at fracking or whether you're looking at putting more money into nuclear, or getting agreement on nuclear and getting more money into renewables, none of those provide an immediate solution to the energy crisis. And so I think what we'll see happening is that the existing drilling that's going on in the North Sea for oil and gas will continue, and we will probably see more drilling licences granted there in the short term as part of a transition. And I think there's general sort of consensus that is how it's going to happen. But at the same time as dealing with the immediate issues, the government does have to, frankly, get its act together when it comes to deciding what the future of this is going to be. As we've seen increasingly at various points over the last few years, and now at sort of really sort of point of urgency, we need to have a sustainable energy supply, security of energy supply that isn't necessarily reliant on more volatile parts of the world.
OK, as you say, Pippa, we're expecting that energy strategy in the next couple of weeks, and we will, of course, be right across the detail. But for now, I want to take you back to yesterday for what was an historic moment in the Commons when President Zelenskyy addressed the House of Commons, the first time in this format. Let's just take a little look at what he had to say.
Please increase the pressure of sanctions against this country, and please recognize this country as a terrorist state. And please make sure that our Ukrainian skies are safe. Please make sure that you do what needs to be done and what is stipulated by the greatness of your country.
President Zelenskyy addressing the Commons yesterday. Emma, were you there? It was quite a moment.
I was there. It was quite an emotional moment, if I'm being honest with you. It still feels quite surreal in a way that we have war in Europe, and we're seeing images that we grew up seeing in history books. You know, people sheltering in the underground, people being torn away from their families, kissing their children goodbye on railway stations. This was our history lessons, and now it's our reality now. And I don't think anyone could listen to that and fail to be incredibly moved and want to help and want to do the right thing. Obviously, the big question is what is that and what does that look like? But yes, I was there. It was a powerful moment of unity in the Commons, and I'd like to say unity across the country for the suffering we're seeing there.
I mean, it was the second time we saw this round of applause across the Commons chamber. Were you there?
I was there. And I think seeing Parliament come together and the message that we had from President Zelenskyy, who I have to say, looking at how he's dealing with the situation, is an inspiration to all of us. Yeah. And I think the heartfelt, emotion, looking at the tragedy, and went through day by day. This is what happened on day one, day two, and looking at what's happening in Ukraine. It's something which ties into our own British history, as he said, in terms of what happened in the Second World War. You fight for your survival. Your backs are against the wall. You know, we need you to stand with us at this difficult, challenging hour. And I think either we do now or we give in to the dictatorship of what Putin's doing. And where he said, either we need your support as a fellow civilized state, I think it's, and he quoted Shakespeare, with regards to whether you do it now or you don't do it. So I think looking at that and then saying, need your support, and I think militarily, economically, diplomatically, the United Kingdom, as he said, is doing everything we can to support Ukraine. Because for me, look, do you know what? Above everything in the world, either you have your freedom or you don't have your freedom. An attack on one freedom is an attack on all freedoms, and we have to support them at these difficult times.
You mentioned there the actions of NATO and the West in this, and President Zelenskyy repeated that call that he wanted a no-fly zone, which the NATO has ruled out for reasons that it doesn't want to come into conflict with Russia. But I just want to show you this front page of the Times. It says, Ukraine to get NATO jets. Now, this was a proposal that was made by Poland to deliver their MiG-29 jets to an American airbase in Germany so that they could then be used by Ukraine. The front pages went to press last night, and then when we woke up this morning, the US had effectively kiboshed this idea. Pippa, are we seeing a fracturing of the unity that we've seen so far among the Western allies over this?
I wouldn't say that it's a fracturing. I think they all share a great desire to do more, and that includes supporting Ukraine where they can militarily. But there has to be a degree of realism And there is a realism amongst Western leaders that anything which could be interpreted by Russia as an aggressive act from NATO suddenly widens the conflicts out beyond the borders of Ukraine. Awful though that conflict is, it would be so much worse if it spread right across Europe, particularly with the unpredictability of somebody like Vladimir Putin in office and the powers and weapons that he has at his disposal. So I think it's an unfortunate reality that by basing NATO, effectively NATO jets on an effectively NATO base in Europe and using them to fly sorties over Ukraine to protect its airspace, to protect its civilians on the ground, would be regarded as an aggressive act, and the West has to avoid that.
Mark?
But as I understand it, one of the things that both Poland and Ukraine have been looking at is the question of not using a NATO base to refuel and arm these jets to repeatedly fly sorties. The question is how to get them into and to Ukraine. You've got to ask, what is the material difference? I was watching a video this morning of a Ukrainian soldier somewhere in the east of Ukraine standing in front of a destroyed Russian tank saying, "We did this thanks to the gifts from Her Majesty the Queen." And what is the difference materially, politically, diplomatically between sending NLAWs from a factory in Belfast on British planes to Eastern Europe on trucks to Ukrainian soldiers to kill Russians and to destroy Russian tanks than Poland providing empty old warplanes to Ukrainian pilots to fly? I think this is very disappointing to see the Pentagon go wobbly. And you've got to say, there have been a lot of Zelenskyy-Churchill comparisons for obvious reasons. What that speech yesterday reminded me of was Churchill in the Canadian Parliament, when he was still trying to persuade America to back us, to help us to survive. And they said Hitler would wring our neck like a chicken, some neck. He's begging for that help, and I think the Pentagon should not be wobbling at this point.
Bremen, that's a good point. What is the difference between what we've supplied and what's being proposed by Poland?
The fact is, it's sanctions, for me, is the right way forward. If you're looking at a militarily perspective, it's, and Mark, on your point, you say, what is the difference? The fact is, it's if you have NATO planes and they want a no-fly zone, if it's NATO planes going from either what people say from a NATO base or up in the air, if they're up in the air in the Ukrainian skies and they've got to take out a Russian tank, then suddenly what you don't want to do is escalate this into what we all don't want to do, a third world war. And I think Putin is trying to draw us into that.
This isn't about the no-fly zone. No, I completely agree. A no-fly zone would involve striking Russian targets, probably in Russia.
But what I'm saying is that if anything gradually creeps into that escalation, then I think this is what Putin may want us to get into. And I think, therefore, to cripple, Russian economy through the sanctions that we've all internationally come together and applied, and especially through SWIFT and the central bank, is, in my view, the right way to do it. Any, suggestion or action which could lead into that military escalation where NATO is drawn in, I think risk the world coming into that third world war concept. And I would not want that, and I don't think anybody would want us to get into that.
Of course not, but part of the difficulty here is people say, well, Vladimir Putin said this would be a provocation and so on. The fact is that Vladimir Putin said lots of things would be a provocation. Russia said letting the Baltics and Poland into NATO would be a provocation. Thank goodness we did it, or they'd be rolling through Lithuania on a mission to protect Kaliningrad right now. They said that allowing Ukraine to apply for NATO or allowing it to have its own democracy would be a provocation. Frankly, too often we've listened to the threats of Vladimir Putin, and that appeasement led us to the point of him being emboldened at this stage.
Emma, would you like to see the West doing more militarily?
I agree with women. I mean, this isn't a game. People sometimes, when you see people commenting on Twitter, it's like it's some kind of computer game and it's not real life. This is real life. These are real decisions. And there's a genuine concern here that this could escalate in the way that Pippa and Roman have outlined. I mean, that should not be dismissed or taken lightly. We can do more when it comes to sanctions. We should do more in terms of sending military. And I get Mark's point around, they had the picture of the soldier who had taken it down and said, with thanks to the UK government. So yes, we can send more military support. Yes, we can send more sanctions. Humanitarian support, and we'll get started on refugees, I'm sure, in a moment. Those all things need to be ramped up, but we cannot take decisions lightly. This is not a game. This is about real life. This is about real prospect of escalating war in Europe. We need to take this seriously, and each step we make needs to be carefully considered and should not be rushed in or pushed into making decisions that are rash.
On that we agree. I think the important thing is that in Westminster, but also among a lot of different Western capitals, where this wasn't always the case, people are now agreed that the much more advanced level of action, like sending anti-tank weapons and so on, you've seen welcome movement from Germany and others on this. The fact is we're now talking about one other step or not. And it's important and positive that, frankly, we're in that debate about exactly where that line is, rather than precisely rather than the position where Berlin was sending some old helmets. It's an improvement.
Emma, you did mention it there, but another aspect of the UK government's response to this is refugees. And there was a pretty stormy session in the House of Commons yesterday where Conservative MPs were among those who criticised the Home Office's slow response, in their words, so far. Now, we understand that there is being another support centre opened up in Lille in France to help those who are applying for visas to come to the UK. And we can speak to our correspondent, Phil Mackey, who is in Lille for us now. Phil, what are you seeing there on the ground?
Not much, to be honest, Alex. There's no sign of this pop-up centre yet. It was talked about yesterday. There was a suggestion it would be open within 24 hours. This morning, that had turned into a possibility of it being opened. We've spoken to the Mayor of Lille's office. They said the first they heard about it was when they read it in the English press. Whether it would be open today, they knew nothing about that either. Neither do the officials in Calais. The suggestion was that this would be a good place to have it. It's not as far as Paris or Brussels, to which people who need to get the right documentation and visas have to travel at the moment. So if you're in Calais, it's just over an hour to get here, and you can get here and back quite quickly. They would lay on free buses. But there's nothing happening at the moment, and nobody seems to know exactly what was going on. I was talking to a 26-year-old woman who's staying in the youth hostel in Calais this morning. She's travelled from Western Ukraine via Romania with her mother and her younger brother. Her dad lives in Reading, so they thought they would be OK to cross. They're stuck there. They've been there a few days now. They had to go to Paris yesterday to give their fingerprints, to go through all the documentation. They're back in the youth hostel. They say they're going to have to wait at least another 5 days. What they're saying is that it's a really confusing picture. It's very... they're hearing one thing from one person, another from another. They're getting different information via the media. Nobody really knows quite what's going on, and it's very slow and confusing as well. We're not talking about thousands of people, Alex. There are hundreds rather than thousands at the moment in France, and obviously many more refugees in other Eastern European countries may get processed there. But it's not looking great, and certainly here on the ground in Lille, they know no more than we do, and there doesn't seem to be any sign of this visa processing centre happening anywhere soon.
Phil, are there any British officials there on the ground at the moment?
Well, interestingly, so as I said, there are a lot of people, French, Ukrainians staying in Calais at the moment, because that's initially where they went to, thinking they could make the crossing either by ferry or via the tunnel. And there must be 30 or 40 in this particular place. And I asked whether or not any British officials had been to see them, and nobody had seen anybody. There was a British official at the ferry directing them to the hostel, but nobody had come to talk to them there. There doesn't appear to be anything going on the ground. It could be. We just don't know what's happening at the moment. There is a British presence in Lille. Obviously, the Channel Tunnel comes in here. It's a major connecting point across the city. And there's a British consulate here and whatever. But we don't know what this visa application centre would look like, how many people it could process. There are all kinds of rumours going around. I won't kind of bore you with them, because actually they just could be rubbish. It's Chinese whispers really on the ground at the moment, Alex, and until we get a clear idea, I can't tell you whether or not any of those Ukrainians are going to come here and be processed, or, as has happened so far, they're going from Calais to Paris or to Brussels for a day and then back to the youth hostel to wait it out and wait to hear whether or not their visa has been granted.
OK, Phil Mackey in Lille, thank you very much for being with us. Roman, it does sound like a bit of a shambles, doesn't it?
Well, I think what we have to look at in the context of it is we're into day 13 of the conflict in Ukraine. The United Kingdom has always made it clear that there is a four-pronged approach: humanitarian, military, economic and diplomatic. From us, at this point in time, working with the Ukrainian government to see what support they need. 400 million is being given to Ukraine. A key part of that is the humanitarian assistance. And I think at this point in time, what we're seeing, Calais is one option, but the largest number of individuals wanting to leave Ukraine is coming through via Poland. And I think the United Kingdom, with its strategic centres, has put extra focus on supporting refugees in those areas. I think it's around 750 now that are being given visas. 10,000 applications are going on. But I think what they are doing, it's in terms of the surge in the number of individuals across the European continent. But what I would say on that is, could we do more? Yes. Are we going to do more? Absolutely. We're into a day 13 situation in Ukraine, and I think with the amount of support we've given, more than any other country bilaterally to Ukraine covers humanitarian support. But of course, on this, we have done a lot, but of course we need to do more.
Emma, Grant Shapps, the Transport Secretary, was this morning saying there's going to be a real ramping up of the number of appointments that are going to be made available. There are staff being sent to the areas, the countries around Ukraine, as well as those support centres opening up in France. Are you satisfied?
It's just another catchphrase, isn't it? I mean, we've heard at pace, and now is it ramping up? Well, both of them are just catchphrases, and neither of them deliver on anything other than some rhetoric and lines in a newspaper. What does it mean? What does it mean when you have people waiting months for an appointment in Poland? What does it mean if you're a family desperate to flee the situation you're facing in the way that we've described it, the absolutely tragedy that they're facing now, and they can't come through to our country? It's an absolute farce. And I have to say, as an MP who deals with the Home Office repeatedly and has done since I've been elected, this isn't the first time the Home Office has found to be fairly incompetent when it comes to dealing with refugees and dealing with asylum and issues of that nature. Talk to any member of Parliament and they'll tell you the same thing. So the government cannot just blame the fact that they've been incompetent and unable to deal with this situation because of the crisis in the Ukraine. The Home Office has been failing for a long time. And while we're at it, sorry, but it does make me very cross, while we're at it, let's look at the Nationality and Borders Bill that's going through Parliament right now and what impact that will have on the number of refugees that are allowed into this country. We have a system here that is designed to make it as difficult as possible for refugees to flee the country they're from. And I believe that is by design, not just by incompetence.
I think the question is, it's in terms of what have we done in practice rather than rhetoric. I think since 2015, the United Kingdom has welcomed over 25,000 vulnerable individuals. With regards to the situation now in Ukraine, on the figures, the capacity to deal with the number of applications initially was about 900 per week. With the surge in resources being targeted to different centres, is up to 6,000 cases can now be dealt with per week in that. So I think on that basis, I think answering 2 points. One, to say whenever we do some is not enough. So 25,000 vulnerable people taken in by the United Kingdom since 2015. And with regards to the capacity to deal with that is from...
You must know that from your casework it's not been working for years.
Let me come back. With regards to the number of cases to be could be dealt with, the surge in number of personnel is from 900 to 6,000, of course. I used to sit on the Home Affairs Select Committee to hold the government to account. Of course, I see where there are challenges, but also I do think it's important to give credit where we are doing some good work in these difficult, challenging times. We've done a lot, we have to do more, and we will do more.
Yeah, but what about this point that Emma's suggesting that it's somehow driven by ideology rather than just the practicalities of the situation? What do you think?
Well, I think it certainly is. There's certainly a problem with Home Office bureaucracy, and we've seen that over many years. And there is a particular drive at the moment, and it is part of the whole UK being able to take responsibility for its own migration laws post-Brexit, to have more say, lots more say from British Parliament and British people into who we allow to come here. We saw a very generous offer to, for example, people from Hong Kong being resettled in the UK. We've seen an Afghan system which has got all sorts of problems going on with it. That's one for another day, probably. And we're now seeing this situation where the government seems to have been pushed incrementally towards a position. Initially, they said it would just be immediate family. They extended that to broader family. They extended that from 1 year to 3 years. And now we're in a position where they're saying that they will ramp up the numbers not only of offices but of appointments in Europe. But it's not happening yet. And it seems astonishing that 20,000 people have applied. Only 700 people, almost 2 weeks into this conflict, have been granted permission to come to their families. We haven't even heard any detail about the second route, the sponsorship route. And I'm interested in you saying that you're going to do more. Do you think, will we actually hear more from the government on different routes to let vulnerable people in here? Should they want to come? Lots of people want to stay in the region so they can go home, but should they want to come here? Because I think the public appetite, the public support for this is huge, and the government seems to be underestimating that.
Raymond, just come back on that point and I'll bring Mark in.
Yeah, people look, of course, I think, should we look at all options? At the moment, we've got two routes. One with regards to, the family and extended family, and then the other ones with regards to getting volunteers and communities to step up Those are the two designated routes. But look, at this point in time, if we're going to stand up and say we're going to do everything we can to support the Ukrainian people, whether it's through military, diplomatic and economic help, of course we have to look at all options. And if there are other options, I would urge the government to look at every possible option to do everything we possibly can to help these people in Ukraine who are suffering immensely at this difficult, challenging time.
Mark?
Yeah, I mean, Raymond's right and Raymond's wrong. He's absolutely right that we are helping in Ukraine and that the UK is helping in the region. That humanitarian aid does matter. You talk to representatives of Ukraine and and Poland, and they say that it does matter. It does make a difference. But, as Pippa says, we keep coming back to this issue where people think, is the Home Office deliberately obstructive or is it kind of incompetent? The depressing answer is that for many, many years it's been a mixture of both. I've dealt with a case of somebody entitled to British citizenship where the Home Office had tried to engage lawyers to reinterpret its own advice because it failed to know what its own law was, and I had to argue otherwise. I don't believe there's any mass opposition in this country to letting people who are in desperate need from Ukraine come here. Freedom-loving people who desperately want to get back to their own country and as a democracy at a safe place as soon as possible. We should be a very, very hostile environment to Putinists in this country and a very safe refuge for people in Ukraine who need to be here. And that needs much swifter action. Just let them in.
Yes. I mean, Emma, on that point, Labour isn't advocating that all visas are waived entirely, that there should be no checks, is it? So where would you try and simplify or speed up this system?
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about very quick, simple security checks before people are allowed to come in, but a much faster process. But I think we need to, after this initial crisis has been dealt with, we do need to look at the way the Home Office operates and the number of poor decisions made by the Home Office in general, because we've been raising these issues. The Home Affairs Select Committee have been raising these issues, individual parliamentarians have been raising these issues for years. Nothing seems to be happening. And I was sat in for the urgent question yesterday with Yvette and Priti Patel up at the dispatch box, and it seems that the government...
It wasn't Priti Patel yesterday, it was Kevin Foster, Home Office Minister.
Well, it was when Priti Patel was in, that might have been the day before then, I apologise. But it was when Priti Patel and Yvette Cooper were up at the dispatch box, and they were talking about this, and it seemed, I was sat there listening thinking, I don't really think the Home Secretary knows what's going on in her own department, because she was arguing back around the point around 50 personnel, despite the fact that a spokesperson from the Home Office has said, it's only been 50 people that have been allowed through. And I think, well, that comes back to this point of incompetence. Either the Home Secretary genuinely isn't aware of what's going on and therefore doesn't have a grip on what's happening and is incompetent, or she's not being entirely honest with the British people about what actually is the situation is. But either way, we have a huge, area of government here, the Home Office, that we desperately need to work effectively to help all those people fleeing, all those people in need. And it's not working. It is failing us all at the moment.
Raymond, Emma's suggesting that this is a question of competence on the part of the ministers in the Home Office.
I think what we're looking at the moment, we're dealing with a unique set of challenging circumstances. Could I say to Emma, could we have predicted Ukraine 3 months ago? The answer is no.
Maybe.
The question is, realistically, with everything going on, but could we realistically have foreseen the different challenges coming and the issue of individuals coming within the UK? The fact is, Emma, if we were, I didn't see Keir Starmer say that at the dispatch box, that he was focusing on other issues. The fact is, we're now
looking at the build-up of Russian personnel around the border. If you want to say 12 months ago, I'll go with it. But a few months ago, we were aware that Russia were building up their military
I would love to go and see those transcripts where Keir Starmer 3 months ago in Parliament was talking about Ukraine and the issue of refugees and Labour's proposals.
We were debating the Nationality and Borders Bill and the policy on refugees.
We are in a situation, these are difficult, challenging times. What I would say is, let's look at what we can do in the future rather than what could have happened, previously. But at this point in time, I agree with Pippa. Looking at those two specific routes and looking at all other options to do everything we possibly can with what Mark was saying, we are a great country, which is a country which supports individuals who are being persecuted around the world, which is what I used to do in government as the Special Envoy for Religious Freedom, who are being persecuted. Yeah. So we have a huge history of welcoming those individuals who are being persecuted. And here in Ukraine, people lose their lives. So we need to support them.
OK, we're just a couple of minutes away from Prime Minister's questions. We can have a look at the House of Commons, which I think is filling up. MPs in the chamber waiting to hear from the Prime Minister. And, of course, that will be overseen by the Speaker of the House of Commons. And on that note, it's probably just worth mentioning something that came out yesterday. This was John Bercow, the former Speaker of the House of Commons. An independent inquiry said that he had been found to be a serial bully. Now, that was something that John Bercow disputed, but we can have a look at this headline from BBC News. Ex-Commons Speaker John Bercow was a serial bully, says report. This was an independent panel which upheld the findings of the Parliamentary Standards Commissioner Catherine Stone. Pippa, I think Labour have suspended John Bercow, we understand, pending an inquiry, but it does seem there's already been one.
Oh, there's an 89-page inquiry there, isn't there? And the facts are pretty damning. There's 21 allegations against him, all of which were upheld. As you say, the ex-speaker has contested some of the findings, but all you need to do is sit and read through the report to see how widespread over how many years they were. And these allegations, of course, are not new. These are ones that have been around for some time, also came to a head a few years ago. And, you know, I think Labour obviously will have its internal processes it needs to go through, its due processes, but you can't imagine it coming to any conclusion really other than that which is presented by this report and concluding that somebody who has exhibited this sort of behaviour shouldn't have a home in the Labour Party.
Mark?
Yes, and even before the allegations about John Bercow himself were eventually concluded and proven, the report says he was a serial bully and that he's a liar in terms of how he responded to the investigation, which is quite, really, I've rarely seen such a brutal set of conclusions. In 2018, there was a judge-led inquiry into the issue of bullying of parliamentary employees, not MPs' employees, which is a wider issue. And that judge concluded that for there to be a start in fixing the institution's cultural problem, the Speaker ought to go. And then there were these allegations against him. And throughout that, I'm afraid quite a lot of people turned a blind eye because they kind of liked him or they found him politically useful. I have to be a little careful because I've done reporting on bullying, talking to MPs' staff in different parties who've experienced some really unpleasant treatment from MPs on a confidential basis. This is a wider and serious issue which I think we're yet to see the full extent of, and I wonder how people who'd suffered that bullying felt when they saw people stand up in the House of Commons and applaud John Bercow as a magnificent person, when an awful lot of people knew that this was a problem.
Emma, briefly, did people turn a blind eye?
I don't know, and I can't get drawn into commenting on individual circumstances and individual people. What I will say, though, is I agree with the point around the climate. I agree with that issue altogether. It's why I think the Labour Party have called for an independent...
Emma, I'm sorry to interject. We've got the Prime Minister on his feet for Prime Minister's questions.
To an address like the one given yesterday by President Zelenskyy. And so I want to tell the House that working with our friends and allies across the free world, we will be doing even more in the coming days to protect the people of Ukraine. And, Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend, the Defence Secretary, will be setting out more details for the House later on. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Polly Latham. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My son Ben died from an aortic dissection at age 44, leaving a wife and 2 young children, a condition which kills 2,000 people every year needlessly, more than die on the roads. Most people do not know anything about this condition until it devastates their family, like mine. So many of these cases are preventable by identifying those at risk and early and accurate diagnosis. Would the Prime Minister commend the work of the Aortic Dissection Charitable Trust in working with all aspects of the patient pathway about this condition? And in particular, will he commit to public funding for research into the diagnosis of aortic dissection and into genetic screening for it?
Prime Minister. May I say to my honourable friend first how very sorry I am, as I'm sure the whole House is, for the loss of her son, Ben. And she's a passionate advocate for this work, and I thank the Aortic Dissection Charitable Trust. She's obviously, Mr. Speaker, completely right that accurate, fast diagnosis and treatment is crucial, and that's why I'm very pleased that the National Institute for Health Research is looking to do further work in this area, and my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Health, will meet her at his earliest convenience.
Now comes the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The typical energy bill is going up by £700 next month, and that's because of pressures before Russia invaded Ukraine. The Chancellor's solution? A forced £200 loan for every household, paid back in mandatory instalments over 5 years. The big gamble behind that policy was that energy costs would drop quickly after a short spike. That bet now looks certain to fail. When will the Prime Minister force the Chancellor into a U-turn?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend, the Chancellor, has set out plans to help families with energy costs, with unprecedented measures to abate council tax by £150, Mr. Speaker, in addition to all the other schemes that we are putting forward. And I can tell the House that, yes, he's absolutely right. That we need to meet the long-term impacts of the spike in energy prices, and that's why I will be setting out an energy independence plan for this country, Mr. Speaker, in the course of the next few days, to ensure that we undo some of the damage of previous decisions taken, not least by the Labour government, to invest in not to invest in nuclear, Mr. Speaker, and so that we prepare our people for the long term and with sustainable, cost-efficient energy supply.
Mr. Speaker, I don't think the Prime Minister understands the mess he's in. Working families are facing a £700 spike in April. They won't even receive their £200 loan from the Chancellor until October. The wholesale price of oil and gas is now ballooning. So, by October, when the loan finally comes in, household bills are set to shoot up by another £1,000. It's a total mess. So I ask again, when is the Prime Minister going to force the Chancellor to U-turn?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, if he's asking for the Chancellor to U-turn on the support that we're giving to families and households, I think that he's absolutely out of his mind. We are going to continue to give people support throughout this difficult period, as we did throughout the coronavirus epidemic, Mr. Speaker, with unprecedented levels of support. We have a £200 discount on bills, £150 non-repayable reduction in council tax, and £144 million extra to help councils support vulnerable families with their energy bills. Altogether, Mr. Speaker, there is a £20 billion package of financial help that we are giving the British people, and we will continue to do more. I think a U-turn, Mr. Speaker, is the last thing we want.
Mr. Speaker, we'll see how long that position lasts. Let me try and help the Prime Minister. Let me try and help the Prime Minister by coming at it from a different angle. Before Russia invaded Ukraine, North Sea oil and gas companies were making bumper profits. BP made £9.5 billion. Shell made £14 billion. In their own words, more money than they know what to do with. Since then, the international price of oil and gas has skyrocketed, and so will their profits. When will the Prime Minister admit he's got this badly wrong, put a windfall tax on those super profits, and use the money to cut household energy bills?
Prime Minister! Mr. Speaker, the net result of that would simply be to see the oil companies put their prices up yet higher, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, make it more difficult for them to do what we need them to do, and which I think, by the way, Mr. Speaker, they are doing very responsibly at the moment, and that is divesting from dependence on Russian oil and gas. And that is the way forward for this country. It is to take a sober, responsible approach, end our dependence on hydrocarbons altogether, and particularly Russian hydrocarbons, and we are taking steps to rectify some of the mistakes made by the Labour government and have a long-term, sustainable, independent energy supply policy. That's what this country needs.
Protecting energy profits, not working people. Doesn't that say it all? Britain can't afford another crisis like this. We need to improve our long-term energy security. That starts with supporting new nuclear and renewables. But the Conservatives have effectively banned new onshore wind. As a direct result of this short-sighted approach, we're using more gas every year than we import from Russia. That's ludicrous. So will the Prime Minister relax planning laws, end the block on onshore wind, and stop supporting policies that make us so dependent on foreign gas?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it's thanks to the policies that this government has pursued that we actually only are dependent on Russian gas for 3% of our gas needs, unlike virtually every other European country, Mr. Speaker. It's thanks to the massive investment that we've had in renewables, Mr. Speaker, that we are, as I've said many times in this House, the Saudi Arabia of wind power, producer of more offshore wind than virtually any other country in the world, Mr. Speaker. And I think he just, by the way, I think he just committed to supporting, this may be news to some of his party, but he just committed to supporting more nuclear power. Great news. There is more joy in heaven, Mr. Speaker. There is more joy in heaven over one sinner that repenteth, Mr. Speaker, than over 100. I'm delighted, and those were the people, Mr. Speaker, who cancelled our nuclear efforts in the time they were in power. They did completely the wrong thing. I'm delighted to welcome them now into the fold.
Come off it. Labour is pro-nuclear. This Prime Minister can't get a single brick laid of a new nuclear plant. Energy security isn't just about supply, it's also about reducing demand. Our housing stock is the least efficient in Europe. That's why Labour set out a plan to upgrade the 19 million British homes that desperately need it within a decade, saving families £400 on their energy bill and cutting UK gas imports by 15%. Whereas all the government have is a failed policy. Taking all their announcements together, it will take 75 years to deliver the upgrades that we need. That's a lifetime when we need urgent action. When is the Prime Minister going to get on with it?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I just remind the House that under the Labour government, our nuclear output fell from, I think, about 25% to about 10% of our energy needs. As I recall, it was because of the decisions that they took. We're now going to rectify it, Mr. Speaker, and we're helping households. He asked about the cost of energy bills. We're helping households with the cost of energy bills to the tune of £9.1 billion. Now, why can this government afford to do that? Why can we afford to put huge quantities of taxpayers' money into supporting households and their energy costs? I'll tell you why, Mr. Speaker. It's because we got the fastest growth in the G7. And don't forget that if we'd listened to Captain Hindsight, we'd have stayed in lockdown and we'd have never achieved it, Mr. Speaker.
12 years in power, and that's the best he can do? The Ukrainian people, Mr. Speaker, the Ukrainian people are fighting for democracy. We must stand with them. That means taking the toughest possible measures against Putin. And let's be honest, there will be costs here at home. We can withstand those costs, and we must, by using a windfall tax to keep bills down for working people. By starting a new era of energy policy, never again at the mercy of a dictator, supporting new nuclear after years of neglect, sprinting on renewables, including onshore wind, and an urgent national mission to upgrade homes, ending years of dither and delay. So why is the Prime Minister offering the same failed energy policy that cast us into the security crisis and allowed bills to rocket?
Mr. Speaker,
Sorry, Prime Minister. I want to hear the answer, but also standing up's not going to catch my eye. In fact, it's got the opposite effect on me. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, what we are junking is the failed energy policies that left us without enough nuclear power, Mr. Speaker. And what we are going to do is go forward with policies that allow this country to be independent in our energy supply, maximising renewables, Mr. Speaker, making sure that we use transitional hydrocarbons and going for nuclear as well. As I say, I'm overjoyed that Labour now seems to occupy that position. But what we will also do, Mr. Speaker, and here he has been supportive, is make sure that as a House of Commons we work together together to maintain our opposition to Vladimir Putin's vile war in Ukraine. And that, together with the toughest possible economic sanctions, by maintaining our military support for the people of Ukraine, I have no doubt that though there will be dark days ahead and difficult times, Mr. Speaker, we will come through it stronger. And I have no doubt that Vladimir Putin will fail and we will succeed in restoring a sovereign and independent Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For over 2 decades, Thames Water has been trying to build a reservoir in my constituency that would be over 30 metres high and cover the equivalent of over 2,500 football pitches. This has been a shadow over the local community, who don't think they've proven the need for this proposal. Does my right honourable friend agree that if a company seeks to do something like this, it has to show why it's needed, why it's better than the alternatives, and what the environmental impact will be? They can't behave as though it's inevitable, whether the local community want it or not.
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend. He's a fantastic champion for his constituents in Wantage. As I understand it, the decision on the Abingdon Reservoir has not actually been made, but we would expect Thames Water to consult further on the proposal, and I know that they will have heard the points that my honourable friend has rightly made.
We now come to SNP leader Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are now 14 days into Putin's war, and in that time, I've generally tried to work constructively with the UK government, and I will continue to seek to do this. However, nobody should support this government when it comes to the response to the refugee crisis. 760 visa approvals in 2 weeks is disgraceful. In that time, Poland has taken over 1.2 million refugees. Hungary has taken over 190,000 refugees. Germany has taken over 50,000 refugees. Italy, over 7,000 refugees. Ireland, a country of just over 5 million people, has given sanctuary to 3 times as many refugees as the United Kingdom. These numbers don't lie. They tell a devastating truth. Does the Prime Minister find it acceptable that his Home Secretary has overseen one of the slowest, most bureaucratic and incompetent refugee responses in the whole of Europe?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think everybody sympathises with the plight of refugees, and this government wants to do everything we can to welcome them, and that is indeed what we are doing. And the numbers are almost 1,000 as I speak to him today, and they will rise very sharply, Mr. Speaker. They are uncapped. We expect those numbers to rise to in the region of the hundreds of thousands. As Vladimir Putin doubles down in his attacks, we will go further, Mr. Speaker, and there will be routes by which the whole country can offer a welcome to people from Ukraine, vulnerable people fleeing from Ukraine. And my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Levelling Up, will be setting out that route in the course of the next few days. This government has a proud record. We've done more to resettle vulnerable people than any other European country since 2015.
Ian Blackford.
I don't think the Prime Minister understands the scale of the challenge or the urgency. These are people fleeing war crimes, torn apart from their families as their homes are shelled, and the Home Secretary is blocking them with endless paperwork. This isn't just incompetence, this is ideology. In the face of the biggest refugee crisis in Europe since the Second World War, the UK government won't set aside the hostile environment. And by the way, we're seeing the hostile environment this afternoon. They might quieten down a bit. We've seen this too many times from a Tory Home Office. The Windrush scandal, the Go Home vans, the inhumane Nationality and Borders Bill. The UK Home Office is raising barriers and bureaucracy when we should be offering care and compassion. Prime Minister, do not let the history of failure repeat itself. Scotland stands ready to offer sanctuary and refuge. So will the Prime Minister join with the rest of the European continent and waive the visa restrictions for refugees fleeing war in Ukraine?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, this country has an unparalleled record. And look, just since I I've been Prime Minister, look at the numbers we've taken from Afghanistan, from Hong Kong, Mr. Speaker. He lectures the Home Secretary. This is a government unlike any other. The Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister, the Home Secretary are directly descended, Mr. Speaker, from refugees. We understand how much refugees have to give to this country, and we understand how much this country has to gain from welcoming refugees. And we will be generous, and we are being generous, Mr. Speaker. And what we are doing is making sure that in those neighbouring countries, the UK is out in front, giving the humanitarian assistance. And we are in every capital, Mr. Speaker. They laugh, Mr. Speaker, they mock, they scoff. This country is leading in every respect, but we are also the single biggest donor of humanitarian aid to the Ukraine war zone, Mr. Speaker. The single biggest donor, and he should be proud of that.
Julian Smith. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I commend the Prime Minister's response to this Ukrainian crisis, but I think people across the country are genuinely concerned on our response on refugees, on the bureaucracy, on the tone of our response. He's shown with vaccines that government change really comes from the very top. Please can I urge him to look at again on resetting our policy and taking control of a more humane approach to those women and men fleeing from Ukraine.
I thank him very much. He will have. I thank him very much. I thank him for all the work that he does in this area. But I hope he will have heard what I've just said in my earlier answer to the leader of the SNP, which is, Mr. Speaker, that this government is, I think, unlike any other in our understanding of what refugees can give and the benefits to this country. And we've done more than any other to resettle vulnerable people since 2015. I think that there is a huge opportunity now for us to do even more, and that's why my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Levelling Up, will be setting out a route by which the British people, not just the family reunion route, which can run into the hundreds of thousands, Mr. Speaker, but also a route by which everybody in this country can offer a home to people fleeing Ukraine. And my right honourable friend will be setting that out in the course of the next few days.
Sir Geoffrey Donaldson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister will be acutely aware of the pressures facing households across the United Kingdom, including in Northern Ireland, with the rapid increase in the cost of heating homes and running a motor vehicle. Heating a home has more than doubled for many households in Northern Ireland in recent weeks. Will the Prime Minister commit to bring forward a package of measures designed to help households, including a cut in VAT on home heating fuel, reducing or cutting excise duty on fuel for motorists? And will he ensure that those measures apply to Northern Ireland, where the Northern Ireland Protocol once again presents a problem in this government taking control over the affairs of all of the United Kingdom? Will the decisions that the Treasury take apply to the whole of the United Kingdom?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we will make sure that we do everything to support the people of the whole of the United Kingdom, including Northern Ireland, and we've already extended a further £250 million to help the people of Northern Ireland with the costs of living, particularly heating. As he knows, excise on fuel has been frozen for the last 12 years, and we will ensure that the people of Northern Ireland continue to be protected, along with everybody in the UK, from the cost of living crisis. But the House should be in no doubt that the pressures on energy will continue. We need a pan-UK solution, and that's what we're going to be setting out.
John Stevenson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Prime Minister, the world has changed. Energy security is vital, but so too is food security. Our food and drink manufacturers and those in the food chain proved their worth during the pandemic. Given the importance to our country of this sector and the need to ensure its competitiveness, its resilience and a high degree of self-sufficiency, will the Prime Minister now take the opportunity to review many of the proposed regulatory burdens, such as HFSS and the promotional and marketing restrictions, which could adversely affect this important sector at this critical time?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, he's absolutely right that food security is a crucial issue, and it is affected, of course, by the cost of energy. And the energy inputs into agriculture are certainly something that we need to address. There is also a separate issue, Mr. Speaker, to do with childhood obesity. The House passed measures already in the autumn, the ones to which he refers. We're giving the industry more time to adjust to the impact of those measures.
Graham Morris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Prime Minister, in addition to the increase in fuel prices, our constituents are reporting to us that the energy companies are doubling standing charges. In France, energy supply company EDF has had energy price rises to domestic customers capped at 4%. But this government price cap allows EDF to increase prices to UK customers by 54%. My question is why?
Mr. Speaker, we have an overall cap, and obviously the EDF is incorporated differently in the UK from its incorporation in France. But we will do everything in our power to abate the costs of energy across the country, as we already are, Mr. Speaker. But what it needs is a short-term, medium-term and long-term energy strategy so that we have sustainable supplies.
Richard Holden.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. Soon after I was elected, I found out that at Shotley Bridge, an 8-bed community hospital in my constituency is replaced with a 0-bed unit, something some Labour councillors had known about but said nothing about during the election campaign. After campaigning hard with ministers and the Secretary of State and working with my local NHS trust, a new 16-bed unit is now in the final stages of planning and has been confirmed as part of this government's hospital building programme. Can the Prime Minister confirm that this new community hospital is now full steam ahead, and will he commit to coming to concert to kick off the building works if the plan goes ahead by the end of next year?
The Prime Minister.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'm delighted there'll be a new hospital at Shotley Bridge. I congratulate him on all the work he's done to lobby for it. And, Mr. Speaker, what it proves that this government is getting on, in spite of the pandemic, in spite of war in Ukraine, this government is getting on with the job.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I've just been to a very harrowing meeting with families affected. They have members of families in care homes and hospitals, and they've suffered unjustifiable denial of access to those loved ones and have been massively restricted. And it continues despite the post-COVID environment. Would the Prime Minister be prepared to introduce legislation to make access to loved ones in care homes and hospitals a legal right and not at the discretion of the care home or the hospital concerned?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank him very much, and I think everybody understands the anguish of people who haven't been able to see their loved ones during the pandemic. We have relaxed the restrictions in care homes, as he knows. If I'd be very happy to offer a meeting for him and the relevant health minister to discuss his further concerns.
John Penrose.
Mr. Speaker, the government's already stopped issuing golden visas, so they can't be exploited by oligarchs and crime lords. But some could already be here, living in luxury London penthouse flats they've bought with dirty cash. So, will the Prime Minister pledge that anybody who is put on the sanctions list in the coming days and is already in the UK on a golden visa will have it ripped up so they can be thrown out?
Prime Minister.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I can tell him that, and I thank the House for what we've done to accelerate the economic crime measures, because we will be able to whip aside the veil of anonymity. Mr. Speaker, the ownership of these luxurious dwellings to which he refers will be exposed, and yes, we will be able to take away their ability to remain in this country.
Barbara Keeley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As energy costs spiral, I want to raise the issue for people who use extra electricity to charge their electric wheelchairs or to run ventilators or a stair lift. It is not right that people with a disability or a serious medical condition should face unmanageable debt or going without food to pay the cost of electricity on which they absolutely rely. They need a real cut to their bills right now, So why isn't the Prime Minister looking at drawing on the profits of the North Sea oil and gas companies to help the most vulnerable families with those costs?
I thank her very much. She raises a very important issue, and clearly the spike in energy prices is going to fall most heavily on vulnerable people such as the ones that she has mentioned, and we will certainly be looking at ways to abate their costs.
Paul Holmes.
I don't know what I've done to deserve that. Residents in the village of Hamble in my constituency are currently facing the prospect of a quarry being given planning permission with 144 lorries per day in this congested area with one road access. Will my right honourable friend agree to meet with me to discuss how we can tighten the regulations on where quarries can be built to take into account the health implication, our environment and our local communities?
Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable friend, and he's a great champion for Eastleigh. The planning framework is robust and should ensure that quarries don't have an adverse impact on the environment or on health, but I'll make sure that he gets a meeting with the relevant minister to discuss his concerns further.
Abhinav Pongasari.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have seen in recent weeks how serious and dangerous Russia's covert influence in Britain can be. Yeah. We have seen that Putin actively seeks to influence the culture, media and politics of democratic nations. Yeah. Our national security is of the greatest importance, and Britain cannot become home to those that prop up Putin and his war. With that in mind, has the Prime Minister ever overruled security service advice when appointing a peer to the other place?
Prime Minister.
No, Mr. Speaker, and actually the Kremlin has singled out the UK for being in the lead on global sanctions, and as they have, and Mr. Speaker, in leading the world in defiance of the odious war that Putin is leading in Ukraine.
Greg Clark.
Yesterday, President Zelenskyy drew on the words of Churchill in this chamber. And as we salute the courage of the people of Ukraine, it reminds us that we can meet in freedom today only because of the courage of a generation of men and women who, in the Second World War, defended us from annihilation. Among them is my friend, Flight Lieutenant Colin Bell, DFC, who flew his de Havilland Mosquito in 50 missions over Nazi Germany. Colin Bell is with us today. On Saturday, he celebrated his 101st birthday. Will the Prime Minister join me in wishing Colin a very happy birthday and thanking him for what he did for allowing us to be here today?
Mr. Speaker, I think the whole House will want to join me in thanking him and wishing Colin Bell a very happy 101st birthday.
Brendan O'Hara.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. People across these islands have displayed remarkable generosity, including in Argyll and Bute, where Oban Helps Ukraine have been overwhelmed by donations of money, of clothes and of offers of shelter. Sadly, this government's reluctance to allow fleeing women and children to come here lags far behind the desire of the people here to provide them with a roof and a bed. Doesn't the Prime Minister fear that when this war is concluded, and despite whatever else it may have done, that his government will stand accused of lacking the one thing the Ukrainian people needed most: basic humanity?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I really don't think that question reflects the views of people around the world, and nor does it, Mr. Speaker, does it reflect reality, because this government has done more than any other European country to support people by way of direct bilateral humanitarian aid, Mr. Speaker, and we have two very generous schemes for allowing people to come to this country. This is a government that believes in welcoming people fleeing from zones of conflict. And, Mr. Speaker, if he shakes his head, look at our record. Look at what we've done. Just in the last 2 years, and he should be proud. He should be proud of what we've done.
Maynard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We were pleased to welcome both the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State to Blackpool the day after the launch of the Doubling Up White Paper. Will he meet with me to discuss how we can make sure that Blackpool is not just a testbed for innovation in many of the areas of Doubling Up, but a showcase for the impact it can have on the community that I represent?
I thank him for his wonderful work in Blackpool for communities he represents, and it was fantastic to be with him and to see the increase, the extension and the upgrading of the tram network in Blackpool, Mr. Speaker, that will help to drive the economy and help to bring high-wage, high-skilled jobs in just the way that we hope to do that across the whole of the UK as we get on with levelling up.
Ed Davey.
Speaker, in the months before World War II, the UK took in over 60,000 Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi persecution. Over half a century ago, we took in over 27,000 Ugandans expelled by Idi Amin. Since then, we've taken Tamils escaping civil war, Bosnians escaping genocide, and Syrians escaping Assad. But this week, the Home Office turned away hundreds of Ukrainian refugees escaping Putin's bombs because they didn't have the right paperwork. Can the Prime Minister not see that this flies in the face of our country's proud tradition of providing sanctuary? And since the Home Office clearly isn't up to the task, will the Prime Minister send in armed forces personnel to speed up the process so Ukrainian refugees can come here quickly and safely?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank him very much, and the whole House wants to do as much as we can and as fast as possible. But what he says about the UK is, I'm afraid, completely wrong, Mr. Speaker, because we have visa centres open in Warsaw, in Budapest, in Prague, in Jeszczał, in Poland, in Chisinau, in Moldova, Bucharest, and elsewhere, Mr. Speaker. We've already got 1,000 people in under the existing scheme. That number will climb very sharply, Mr. Speaker. Look at what we've done already. 15,000 from Afghanistan, 104,000 applications from Hong Kong Chinese, and I think there were about 25,000 from Syria. No one has been turned away, Mr. Speaker. That is simply, we want to be as generous and Mr. Speaker. It is important to have checks. Let me make this point to the House, because I think people need to understand. There are some people, Mr. Speaker, who would like to dispense with checks altogether and simply to wave people through. And I've got to say, and I hear the voices on the benches opposite. I do think that is irresponsible, and that is not the approach that we should be taking. The Schengen countries have a different arrangement. We must be in no doubt, as I said in answer to a previous question, the Kremlin has singled out this country for the approach that we are taking. Vladimir Putin, and we know how unscrupulous Putin can be in his methods. It would not be right, Mr. Speaker, to expose this country to unnecessary security risk, and we will not do it, Mr. Speaker. We are going to be as generous as we can possibly be, but we must have checks.
Billy.
Mr. Speaker, my community in Tipton came together on Sunday to commemorate the 100 years since the devastating explosion of the Dudley Port munitions factory and the 19 girls who were recklessly murdered by the owner of that factory. Now, in the Black Country, it's vital that we acknowledge both the pride but also the pain of our industrial heritage. And can I ask my right honourable friend, therefore, to reaffirm his commitment today to the Black Country, to ensure that we honour that legacy of those girls in that factory in Dudley Port 100 years ago. And the one way that my right honourable friend can do that for my community in Tipton is to come to Tipton, Mr. Speaker, and see that beating heart of the Black Country who will welcome in with open arms.
Well, Mr. Speaker, long ago, when I was a reporter, Tipton was on my beat many years ago, and wild horses wouldn't keep me away from Tipton. I'll be back.
Ronnie Cowan's final question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Prime Minister, I have a constituent whose elderly parents are seeking refuge in the United Kingdom from Ukraine. Her parents are both in their 80s. They've made it to Hungary. They went to the visa application centre, as instructed by the Home Office hotline, and they were told, come back on the 22nd of March. Then, and only then, will their biometrics be processed. That is a harsh reality, no spin, no subterfuge. Prime Minister, when will refugees from the Ukraine be welcome into the United Kingdom?
Prime Minister.
Listen, I thank him. If you'd be kind enough, I'd be grateful if he'd pass me the details of the case that he mentions, and I'd be happy to give it to my right honourable friend. We are moving heaven and earth, Mr. Speaker, because we understand the value to this country of refugees. We also understand the imperative of helping people fleeing a war zone in terror. And that's why the people of this country want to open their arms. And we are going to help them to do it, Mr. Speaker, with a new humanitarian route in addition to the family reunion route that we have already set out. That family reunion route alone, Mr. Speaker, could bring hundreds of thousands of people here. And I think the whole House understands that. We will do even more through the new humanitarian route.
That's the end of Prime Minister.
The Prime Minister there ending that session of Prime Minister's questions, and he ended on a note about refugees and the government's response to refugees who are fleeing Ukraine. We'll come to that a bit later, but Sir Keir Starmer chose to go on energy and the cost of living. He renewed his call for a windfall tax on energy companies to help mitigate the costs that households will be facing with increase in energy prices. The Prime Minister talked about their longer-term plan to move away from a dependence on hydrocarbons and to renewables, and he talked about the support the government is putting in place for households. So to discuss all of that, I am joined now by Paul Scully, MP, who is the Business Minister, Jim McMahon, the Shadow Environment Secretary, and Vicki Young, who is the BBC's Deputy Political Editor. And Vicki, what did you make of that Prime Minister's question session?
I think actually it was interesting that Sir Keir Starmer decided not to go on refugees, leaving that to others. And as you say, we'll come to that in a bit, and focusing instead on this cost of living crisis, which people are calling it. And you know, it already looks like that. Everyone's had their energy bills already. This is the pre-war impact. Hundreds of pounds, and some in the industry suggesting that the average bill could be between £3,000 and £4,000. It's simply eye-watering. Now, the government has offered some help, but I think the point Sir Keir Starmer's making there is that this is only going to get worse and you need to do more. Now, I think it helps Labour. They've got a plan saying that they want this windfall tax on the energy companies. Boris Johnson very much ruling that out and seemingly ruling out any extra help. But I think the feeling, even amongst some Conservative MPs, that more is going to have to be done. And the big question, of course, is what is that going to be? The Chancellor, is he going to intervene? Are we going to see the interventions like we had with the COVID pandemic? Is he in the place where he's about to announce something like that? Now, the suggestions from the Treasury are no, not at the moment. That's not what they're planning on doing. And as you say, Boris Johnson talked about longer-term issues there, about nuclear, for example, other people pressing him on onshore wind farms. Can they do more on all of that? But I think this is going to be a massive problem, and Tory MPs know it because their constituents are telling them.
And we've got the spring statement from the Chancellor in a couple of weeks. Do we think that that may be the point at which the pressure grows or he responds to some of this?
That is the moment he could do that. But at the moment, the Treasury seem to be suggesting actually they have made their announcement. They're sticking with that for now. That means people will get some help in October, but it is effectively a loan. You do have to pay it back. And as I say, this is before the impact on the prices of the war. So it's going to get even worse. And so that element of the government saying they're not going to do anything now, but will they be pushed to do it? I think there's lots of people who think that it is inevitable.
Paul, do you think that's right? The government's going to have to do more? Going to budge on this?
Well, look, the Chancellor's not going to sort of make up tax policy on the hoof, so he has to look at the public finances as a whole, and so that's the money coming in so that we can pay for services, but also domestic consumers who we've said we're absolutely prioritising. But I've just left a load of hospitality businesses to come here, who are lots of them small businesses as well, and they've got pressures. So clearly we need to make sure that we're doing everything we can. I think the Prime Minister was quite clear, though, a windfall tax not only just would mean that they would subsidise that by putting more money on the bills anyway, the energy companies, and it would also reduce the investment that they're putting to diversify from that long-term view by diversifying away from fossil fuels. Because at the moment, we're only like 3% exposed to Russian gas, but we're 100% exposed in our fossil fuel dependency on global prices.
Jim, Sir Keir Starmer did repeat that call for a windfall tax, which Labour has asked for before. But as Vicki said, that was before the war in Ukraine, which we expect to exacerbate this crisis around energy costs. So is Labour calling for something else now? What would Labour be doing that's more in this situation?
Well, we've been very clear that the government have run out of ideas and that Labour's plan to have a windfall tax on the oil and gas giants in the North Sea that have done very well. I mean, they themselves have said that they've had a boom time during the pandemic because of the amount of money that they have made. And what we're saying is now is not the time to pass on the increased cost to the consumer, that the giants can do far more to make sure that they tax more to get that money right through to consumers. And it strikes me that the government have made a fundamental error. You know, we knew that prices were going to go through the roof. The government knew that prices were going through the roof. And the idea that you put a £200 loan in place on the presumption that eventually energy costs will flatline and begin to decline now feels very foolhardy. And so the government needs to come forward urgently with a plan, and it needs to be far more ambitious than what they've done so far.
Paul, do you think the Chancellor does need to take a similar approach to what he did at the start of COVID, which is no holds barred, we'll do what we have to here?
Well, first of all, not all of the solution that the Chancellor put in place before was smoothing out the prices through a cut in bills now and reclaiming it later on. There were also measures given to houses on the lower end of the council tax band as well, and obviously all of the other things, the warm home discount and that still remain in place to support people. But what the Chancellor has done since he's become Chancellor throughout the COVID process, pandemic, is he's looked at public finances, but he's also looked at what is happening on the ground and flexed. He's making those decisions in the round, holistically, not just knee-jerk, because these have got to be sustainable for public finances. They've got to be sustainable for the long term.
Right, we've been talking about energy costs there, but of course the squeeze on the cost of living is more broad than that. And this morning the Work and Pensions Select Committee held a hearing, and giving evidence to that hearing was Jack Munro, who is a food poverty campaigner and activist. And I'm pleased to say he can join us now. Jack, thank you very much for coming in. Now, during that session this morning, you talked about some of the impact on this squeeze on living standards. You spoke about every pound spent on children's health now would save £220 down the line, so investing for some sort of return. Talk me through those figures. How do you come to that?
Yeah, that's a report that I came across a couple of years ago now when I was researching the impact of living in a cold or damp accommodation on long-term health conditions. And I need to dig out the report because the Select Committee were very interested in reading it. But it's basically the investment in early years education, free school meals, fruit, milk for kids, and warm, safe, decent homes. For every pound that's invested in those things, you gain back £220 in savings on healthcare, on justice, on social support. So it's I've spent a decade making the emotional argument why giving people enough food to eat and enough heating in their homes and safe, decent accommodation is the right thing to do. But there's a very strong economic argument for it as well.
And just talking about numbers again, you said 4.1 million people in the UK are living in poverty. I mean, that's a big number.
Yeah, and 4.5 million people in the UK are currently living in fuel poverty. And that number is set to rise to 6.5 million people in April when the energy prices kick in, and it will rise further to 8.5 million people by October. And that's absolutely shocking. Before the pandemic, one of my fellow panellists today who was speaking on behalf of Energy Action said that 80 people a day were dying in the UK as a result of living in cold homes. And that was pre-pandemic, before Ukraine, before everything. So those figures are set to be an awful lot worse.
I mean, Jack, we have got a minister here. So as you're talking about the cost of living squeeze pre the war in Ukraine, what would you say now that you'd want to see done?
I think that people are really struggling and really suffering at the moment, and a lot of people are, and that is only going to get worse. And we need a rapid intervention in order to lift those people out of poverty, out of cold homes, out of hunger, out of those difficult circumstances, because it's not something I say lightly. People are dying. People have died, and more people will die. And we've seen that the Chancellor can find a whole orchard of magic money trees for his pet projects, for things that he deems to be worthy, Eat Out to help out, writing off furlough fraud, and he needs to go and dig around in that orchard and find some money for people who don't have the same recourse, don't have the same voice, don't necessarily have sort of the same lobbying power, and that's children, disabled people, vulnerable people, elderly people, and act in their best interests as well.
Paul?
Some really interesting points there, Jack, and I'd be interested to see. I'll go back and look back at the evidence you gave this morning. It sounds fascinating. Really important issue. I think some of the difference was something like the Eat Out to Help Out, for example. It's a one-off hit, a good amount of money, as you say, rightly say. What we've got to find is those sustainable solutions so that we can be supporting children in exactly those kind of environments and families in those environments over the months and years ahead. What we've done, because you talked about free school meals, I think one of the things that we did there, for example, is that we targeted very much, rather than just every child, including whose parents might be able to afford to support their children through school meals, targeting it very much at the people that needed most intervention, the lowest paid, and people with possibly a wider domestic issue that you could look at. And we did that through the holiday activity programme, where they could engage in sport, other activities. They could almost be triaged, basically, because you could get a feeling of what wider support they might need whilst giving them a good meal.
Jim, is that right? Targeted interventions the way forward?
That certainly wasn't my experience during the pandemic in Oldham, where my time was spent giving out sandwich packs to children who couldn't eat. It was spent on the Fair Share programme, giving out food to families that couldn't afford to put food on the table. And let me tell you, the real life implications are, it was nurses who were coming for those food parcels, it was social care workers who were coming for those food parcels. People are sinking in this, you know, they can't keep their head above water. And it was bad enough with the cost of living crisis on energy, on food, on transport, on people's everyday domestic bills. But then the government come back with a double whammy of a national insurance increase, of council tax increase, the personal tax allowance changes is going to cost people even more. And then they take away the universal credit uplift. I mean, families are really struggling now, and when they look to the government to say, what are you going to do to help, I'm afraid they're not just found wanting, they make it even worse.
Paul, making it worse?
No, I mean, look, the council tax increase is obviously is for councils to decide how they're managing their budgets. But in terms of the national insurance changes, that's very much there, targeted to increase the spending in the NHS to come up with to tackle the backlog. And that's what I mean about looking at the public finances as a whole. Cost of living is a massive issue. Clearly, it's a massive issue that we need to tackle. We clearly need to keep people well as well. So we've got to fully fund the NHS in the right way. That's what I mean about the Chancellor flexing, but looking at the public finances on a sustainable footing.
Jack, you've been campaigning on this for a long time. Do you get the sense that the reception is now changing, that people are listening to what you're saying?
Very slightly, very slightly, but there's still an awful lot of work to do, and I can't help but, you know, think that if people had listened when those of us who started to raise the issue a decade ago, we certainly wouldn't be in the situation we're in now. I'm quite interested in Paul's comment about Eat Out to Help Out being a one-off cash payment, because actually the policy groups that I was in with today in the Select Committee, the Resolution Foundation, Social Policy Fund Forum, they all advocated a one-off cash lump sum of around £500 in order to help lift people out of the cost of living crisis, in a mirror of what America did in the pandemic, to give all of their citizens £500 to let them make the judgment calls and decisions themselves about how best to rescue their household budgets and how best to sort out the situations that they're in. But when people who are in the lowest income deciles, when you give them money, it goes back into their local economies. You give people who earn the top 0.1% of wages in the UK money, it disappears off to the Cayman Islands. So giving people a one-off lump sum payment in order to dig themselves out of whatever holes they're in isn't just something that us mad left-wingers are banging on about. It's what the government's own think tanks and policymakers are avidly recommending.
Paul, your thoughts on that idea?
Well, I mean, which is exactly what we did with the universal credit uplift. That's why during the pandemic we had that uplift. It was an emergency situation which we gave. We've also, because it was an emergency situation, but it was that specific hit that we needed to support people through. I think what is also a good driver of tackling poverty, yes, absolutely, cash is absolutely the heart of it. But there's wider interventions in other situations that are worth examining and looking at in the round. But we've also, because I'm the minister that looks after the national living wage, and we've increased that by the highest cash in cash terms ever. And it's right that we actually make sure that we're not recovering our economy on the back of the lowest paid. So whilst we're looking at supporting businesses, what we're not going to do is allow them to undercut pay.
That's exactly what's happening. That's exactly what's happening. BP and Shell have made record profits, but they're not being asked to contribute more. It's households that are being asked to contribute more. During the pandemic, there's parts of the economy that boomed. Amazon. The online giants boomed because people are ordering shopping to be delivered at home. We're not taxing them. We're seeing our high streets go to the wall where the shutters are down and the windows are boarded up. You know, the government have got the priorities completely wrong on this.
Well, I think with that, I mean, if you look at BP and Shell, you look at the losses that they made the previous year, because actually some of the profits are accounting changes, but nonetheless, they are making big profits, but we want them to invest that in diversification away from fossil fuel. And what we don't want to do is also, as I say, if you had a windfall tax, get them to just shove up the bills anyway to try and claw back some of that windfall tax, which inevitably will happen in a free market.
Jack?
I'm sorry, Paul, but I really have to take issue with the fact that you say that the government are not going to recover the economy off the back of the lowest paid people, because that has been Conservative policy for the last 12 years. Austerity-led ideology has meant that people who have the least in this country have routinely been asked to shoulder the burdens of the bank bailouts and of all of the policies that the consecutive Conservative governments have put in place to reduce welfare payments, to reduce the support that's available for the poorest and most vulnerable people in the lowest income households. The economy has been rebuilt. What little green shoots we have has been rebuilt on the bodies of the dead people who are no longer with us because they have been failed by the Department of Work and Pensions.
Yeah, I mean, clearly, look, I don't agree with that. I mean, the economy that we had, the fact that as we were creating, after the bank crash, we were creating more jobs than the rest of Europe put together. And the best way of tackling poverty is getting people into work and working more hours, and that's what more people want. The national insurance changes that Jim was talking about, for example, 6 million people will not be, of the lowest paid, will not be affected by those at all. 50% of the levy that's raised from that will be from the top 15% of earners, top 15 raising 50%.
OK, I want to bring Vicki in.
Just very quickly, you were saying earlier, and I think this is the really interesting when it comes to the political debate, you talked about the COVID and the help with COVID and the pandemic and about that being, you know, an emergency situation. And I think this is the key thing here, isn't it, over the next few months, whether it becomes clear that this is an emergency situation with people struggling with the bills and it only getting worse. And I think that is going to be what dictates an awful lot of the political dynamic over the next few months.
We've got to get this right. We've got to get it right. We put £408 billion into the economy through COVID. That gives me, as a free market Conservative, 408 billion reasons to get this next bit right, so that we don't choke off the recovery. We can keep the jobs for people. We can tackle poverty.
Vicki, I want to ask you about something else that came up at Prime Minister's questions, and that's the government's response to the refugee crisis that's stemming from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. There was some criticism, I think it's fair to say. Julian Smith, the former chief whip, said there needs to be a reset of the government's attitude on this.
And really interesting, he said it comes from the top, very much putting this on Boris Johnson, actually, because the feeling is that if Boris Johnson came out and said, sort this out, it would be sorted, because that's what happens here. Now, there's a lot of debate amongst Conservative MPs too about whether this is about the policy being wrong and not generous enough despite the words, or whether there are operational problems. I'm interested in talking to Phil Mackey earlier, where he sees no sign of this reception centre in Lille, doesn't seem to be there at the moment, and that's the problem they've got at the moment. And I spoke to someone, a Tory MP, who says he's in a constituency where they've been complaining about people coming over the channel in boats. They've been very against all of that, and he says he thinks the government's completely misjudged the mood, where he says this is totally different. He has lots of constituents saying, I've got a room, I will help a Ukrainian family, how do I do it?
Paul?
Yeah, and that's why the sponsorship route that the Prime Minister mentioned in Prime Minister's question will get fleshed out, and you'll have the detail.
But it's not there yet, that's
within
the
the next couple of days. Absolutely, but I think the point is this is very different from Syria and Afghanistan, where actually we had troops in there and it was we had corridors to get out. Most people in Ukraine, the reason that actually the EU have stepped up is because you can literally walk out of Ukraine into Poland, into the EU. Then you've got the Schengen area around that where people can travel freely. But nonetheless, we have that rich history of supporting people, and that's why we're stepping up both the family routes that are already there, but that will increase. The 10,000 applications that we've had will undoubtedly go up to the couple of 100,000, I should think. But that sponsorship route is going to be really, really important for us to lean into.
Jim, Boris Johnson said that the UK government was being very generous about this, but he said there had to be some security checks. Labour agrees with that, don't you?
We absolutely agree that you need a robust system in place, and one that can't be abused, but what we can't do is to view every person who's fleeing persecution with suspicion as if they're the enemy when they're not. They're our fellow people, and they're but for the grace of God. If that was any one of our family, we'd want to make sure that countries around the world would step up to their responsibilities, and we're not. You know, we've got a government that has given 2,500 golden passports to Russian oligarchs and their extended family, and just 700 emergency visas to people that are fleeing persecution. Listen, there is no reason why we couldn't get ahead on this. The Home Office has failed, and they need to fix it today. I heard the Defence Secretary say that 3 weeks before the invasion, they were mounting troops on the border to make sure they had the on-the-ground protection and support required. So why does the Ministry of Defence take 3 weeks to marshal resources on the ground, but the Home Office now, 12 days after the invasion, still haven't got their act together?
We're stepping up by sevenfold the amount of staff that we've got in visa centres around Europe, and that's to reflect the number of applications. But you know, you saw Ed Davey in Prime Minister's questions comparing to previous evacuations, and he was talking about how many people we were taking over months. As Jim said, this is 2 weeks. We clearly want to act quickly. We want to
and you know
have
some of your colleagues are
now.
frustrated at the
Absolutely. Look, I've been speaking to friends of mine in Ukraine that I met when I was there a few years ago. They are in Poland at the moment. Some of them are in Poland at the moment, have already made that journey right the way from the other side of the Ukraine. We clearly want to help them, and that's why that sponsorship route that will be outlined ASAP will be really, really important.
OK, well, we will look forward to the details of that sponsorship route. I'm sure we'll follow that closely. But for now, thank you to all of my guests, Paul Scully, Jim McMahon, Jack Monroe and Deputy Political Editor Vicki Young. We will be back tomorrow with Politics Live at 12:15. I do hope you can join us all then. But for now, have a very good afternoon. Bye-bye.